Before that time.
It's the physics behind, for example,
another
reactions,
question.
the actual change in
Under
mass.
the ultimate question gets to evaluate
Over the course of 7 years, the book was put together.
Welcome to the Scholars Chair. Tonight, a conversation with V. Bradley Lewis. He is an author and associate professor at Catholic University of America, School of Philosophy. At Focus, Political Threats to Religious Freedom in America. Our conversation right here in the Scholars Chair.
Let the conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is truth?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholars Chair every Monday night. Welcome to the Scholars Chair, Professor Lewis. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
You know, Professor Lewis, I wanted to ask, and I usually ask all the scholars to come here, where did you get your PhD?
At the University of Notre Dame.
And you've been teaching at Catholic U for?
20 years.
For 20 years. This is a fascinating article that you wrote here. I was very, very engaged in it. I want to ask you, the title is fairly long, but I wanted to get you to tell us why you wrote it. The title is Religious Freedom, the Good of Religion, Common Good, and the Common Good, the Challenges of Pluralism and Privilege, and the Contraceptive Services Mandate. Tell me, what is the backdrop for this article and what you're trying to communicate to us?
Right. Well, I was trying to, the title is very long because I was trying to fit together a number of different ideas that were related to one another. I was interested in religious freedom as a question in political philosophy, which is the field that I study really, and it's an important issue in political philosophy in particular. And at that moment, there was a public controversy going on because when I wrote that article, it was in 2011, I think, and the Healthcare Reform Act had just been passed, and it included in it a mandate that insurance plans provide contraceptive services at no cost. And a number of religious institutions, Catholic institutions, but not only Catholic institutions, other religious institutions, so universities, and in some cases, other religious organizations that were attached to religious groups objected to that mandate as a violation of their religious freedom because they opposed contraception as a moral question, and they didn't think they should be required to provide it to their employees. And so they held that that particular mandate was a violation of their First Amendment freedoms, and even under legislation, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So there was a lot of litigation. There were lawsuits about this, including from my own university, the Catholic University of America. And so it was a public controversy whether and how to understand religious freedom in the context of this legal and political controversy. At the same time, there were some scholars, legal scholars and philosophers, who were making arguments that in fact it was wrong for the law, and especially the Constitution, but even ordinary laws, to single out religion for constitutional protection. That indicated there was something special or privileged about religion, which is why that word wound up in the title. Yes. That everything that, say, the First Amendment to our Constitution, which protects the freedom to exercise religion, protects, that could have been protected through protection of freedom of speech or freedom of association, or some of the other rights that are protected by the Bill of Rights. So they were challenging the notion that religion required a particular recognition and protection within the Constitution and the law. And so I sort of put all of that together and made an argument about the nature of religious freedom, the scope of religious freedom, and then the application in that particular case of the mandate in the healthcare reform with these arguments that some legal scholars had made against the notion that religion deserved to be particularly protected by the law, and I argued that it should.
Is the notion of natural law, I think, is one of the elements that I saw in your article here. I was curious. You have written in the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion, your April 2013 issue, alluding to Pope Benedict XVI. I must tell you, I have real problems with him, but that won't keep us from having a conversation. He spoke about religious freedom, and he talked about them in this way, that they are ethical terms deriving from nature and nature's God, which is the echo of Jefferson, it seems like to me. And then he goes on to talk about that these trends that are these philosophical trends or these social trends like reductionism, individualism, and skepticism were a threat to the church's public moral witnessing of the religion, I would think. And he's talking about that this is also a challenge from the radical secularism, which really is attempting to reduce the scopes of religious expression. How do you reconcile yourself personally, religion, and those modern threats to religious expression?
Well, that was a speech that Pope Benedict, at the time he was Pope, gave actually to American bishops who had visited Rome, and he spoke to them, and it seemed to be significant at the time, in particular about what he took to be threats to religious freedom. And because he was speaking to American bishops, he invoked America's history of religious freedom and toleration. And I think you're quite right. He was alluding to Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, which says that there are certain inalienable rights that come from nature and nature's God. So that notion is sort of built into the American political tradition. He was sort of telling the bishops, look, you need to defend this, you need to protect it. And he was concerned about particular threats, so reductionism, which is a way of describing how sometimes, especially modern science, tries to take a phenomenon like religion and reduce it to something material, to some kind of causal account that leaves out what most of us think is included in religious belief.
The belief in God.
Exactly, the belief in God and the free will that people exercise when they commit themselves to a religious faith, and certain other trends like a kind of aggressive secularism, which argues that religion should not have a voice in public affairs, that people should not use religious arguments in public affairs. And he was arguing that this was, in a way, he was trying to remind the bishops, look, this is not usually how we understand the American tradition, which, of course, religious arguments have always informed public life in the United States. I mean, going all the way back to the founding, and certainly you can't imagine American history without the rhetoric of Abraham Lincoln, which was often very biblical, or the contributions of people like Martin Luther King, which was a very religious language, and many other examples as well. And he wanted to oppose the forces that seemed to want to preclude the contributions of religious people and religious discourse in American life.
How would Jefferson bring this forward in terms of how was he using the word religion? Was he thinking about the many churches around, or was he thinking about conscious liberty?
Well, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson doesn't talk about religion. He talks about the inalienable rights that people have, which ultimately come from nature and nature's God. So natural rights, what we usually call them. Now he mentions life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think, the Declaration of Independence sets a kind of overall theory and goal for government, and it's the Constitution that then creates an institutional context for precisely those natural rights,
Yes.
most of which are recognized by the Bill of Rights.
Yes.
And of course, the first of which includes both a ruling out of an established church, but then also a guarantee that people will be able to freely exercise religion.
I see. Yes, yes. This was, of course, I thought was very nicely clarified in his writings on religion itself, religious freedom in America. He talked about that in some length. And again, I'm coming back to this conscious liberty position, and I'm only thinking about it that it would broaden the tent of a lot of different, well, every human being. And I think that's where we really are winding up, isn't it, the freedom of conscience.
Well, certainly, one of the arguments that I wanted to make there was that we should see religion as one of the basic forms of good that people participate in. And those goods are really the reasons for our actions. And there are a number of goods that serve as the basic reasons for our actions, but I wanted to argue there, and it's not original to me, other people have made this argument, that religion is one of them. So in other words, that religion is something that is perfective and fulfilling of human beings.
Yes.
And so serves as a reason for doing all kinds of things, and a reason that cannot be further reduced to some other good, which is why I say it's a basic good, because it can't be reduced to anything else. But it's a function of human nature, ultimately, that we have this good that we pursue.
That's interesting, because I don't think most people think about their religion as being a part of the fundamentals of being human, basically. I find that very, very stimulating. And you go on to write about Benedict, and as you know, every time I say his name, it cringes. But he talks about that there are some religious freedoms that need defending, which you've just said so very well, and they should be done so in large measure in rational public discourse. And he goes on talking about that it is a basic, intrinsic, fundamental good itself. That's interesting, because you don't think about religion as being that fundamental to the human existence. It seems to me that there's just so many different approaches to it. I mean, when you say religion, you have to talk about what you have to talk about all the various different religions that are available to us. But you're approaching it from a much broader place. Explain.
Yeah, that's right. When I use the word religion in that article, I'm thinking in particular about the way that it's used, for example, in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas,
yes,
who is one of the great really thinkers in the Western tradition, particularly important within the Catholic tradition. And Aquinas discusses religion as a virtue. He says it's a virtue, and a virtue is a disposition that a person has that leads them to want to perform certain actions. And for Aquinas, the virtue of religion is in fact a part of the larger virtue of justice. And justice is the virtue that disposes us to give to other people what they're due, that is, to respect the rights of other people. And yes, in the case of religion, what we're concerned with is giving God what God is due. So the recognition of what we owe God, which for Aquinas is fundamentally worship, and recognition of God for what He is. And so, and that notion of religion, he gets ultimately from ancient sources, especially from Cicero, from a great Roman philosopher. So for him, it's a virtue, and as a good, religion indicates a kind of harmony between one's own will and the greater than human ground and source of everything that is.
I like that. I love that expression, but carry on that. I didn't interrupt you. The greater than human position is a very interesting one. Would that lead us to a notion of the unity of gods? Because in Hinduism, of course, there are multiple gods. Would we have multiple attributes of God? Is that your... Would you put it in that direction at all?
Well, it's interesting that for Aquinas in particular, there's this virtue of religion, and Aquinas is a Christian, so he's got a certain Christian conception of God, and he's familiar with the conception of gods in the other great revelatory traditions of Judaism and Islam, and he's also familiar with the pagan gods.
Yes.
And he's treating it there as a kind of natural virtue. But so then the question becomes, well, if you say that you need to give God certain things, God deserves worship, what kind of worship? And he doesn't say very much about that there, because the content of worship, the content of what we owe God, is something that generally follows from a particular religious tradition.
Right.
And in the Christian tradition, that's really comes from revelation. It's the content of religion, the form of worship and so forth, is not something that you could arrive at necessarily through rational argument. That there is religion, that it is virtue, that there's a good of religion that has to do with the harmonization of one's own will with the greater than human source of everything that is. That's a notion you can arrive at through natural reason. But exactly what the form of worship that you should engage in, what things you should do for God, what rituals or prayers one should use, is generally something that comes from a specific religious tradition.
Yes.
So when Aquinas is talking about the virtue of religion, and when I talk about it in that article, I mean it in a moral sense, in a rational sense. But then it's supplemented by the content of particular religious traditions, and of course many different ways.
Interesting idea. When you stated in your article, the good of religion itself is a irreducible aspect of human flourishing. I just love the way that sentence rolled off the tongue. Human flourishing coming from the good of religion. I think that's a great idea. What data do you have to justify the assertion?
I don't base it on data because when I speak there, and again, this is not original to me. I mean, other philosophers have written about this. Religion as a good that's irreducible and as a basic form of good. And there are other basic forms of good, things like knowledge and life, social activity. Those are all basic forms of goodness. These are things that we pursue because they are perfective of us and they contribute to our overall flourishing and happiness. So I'm speaking practically there. And if one is engaged in practical reasoning, which is to say reasoning about what you would do and the way that you would live, the very first principles of practical reasoning are practical principles.
Right.
And they're things that we recognize in our own conduct and the conduct of other people. We don't infer them from empirical generalizations or data. Rather, we recognize them as the irreducible motives and ends of our own actions. Now, you can speak about them empirically, and you can say, how is it that people live in such a way as to pursue the good of religion? Well, in this religious tradition or this period in history, they do it in this way or they do it that way. And one can speak about a kind of anthropology or sociology of religion or something like this.
Yeah.
But when we think about it as a good that justifies our actions, there we're thinking about it in a fully practical way.
I see.
And understanding it from the context of our own experience of our practical reasoning.
Yes. And of course that sets us up to a tremendous amount of necessary discussions because everyone's good is not everyone's good. So I was just curious whether there was an expansion on what we understand to be good. Are you assuming that most of us understand what is good and is good a rational process that you can work out and determine what is the ultimate good? Or do we just accept it?
Well, I do think most people do agree about the most basic principles of practical reasoning, which is to say the most basic goods. So things like life, that life is a good, which would include things like health, that one wants to remain healthy and vigorous and continuing to live, or that knowledge is a good. It's better to know than not to know, and even our ordinary human curiosity is evidence of this. That sociality is a good. Sometimes it's a good that we call friendship, that just a relationship between persons where both people want the best for one another and they live in such a way as to promote one another's good. And all of those are reasons for action. They justify our actions. Now, how a person pursues those goods, it can be very different. Everybody's life is different in that they devote different attentions and different amounts of attention to the pursuit of particular goods and perhaps not others and so forth. But the sort of theory that I use in that article is one that holds that there are a finite number of basic goods that serve as the very first principles of all of our practical reasoning. And so any decision we make or any train of practical reasoning can ultimately be traced back to one of these goods, but no further.
Are you using the term the first experience as Aristotle will use it, that it is something I hear, see, smell, touch?
Well, again, it's not so much empirical as it has to do with our decisions about our actions. So, for example, if a person is fasting, they're not eating, and you say, why aren't you eating? I mean, you're with a person and it's lunchtime and everybody's eating and the other person's not. You go, well, why aren't you eating? And you say, well, it's a religious obligation. Oh, well, I see. I mean, once you've said that, you don't really need to say anything more.
Interesting.
It serves as a complete and satisfactory explanation of your action. Or if you gave $20 to somebody, and somebody says, can I have $20, and you give it to them, and somebody else doesn't know, and they say, why did you give that guy $20? And you might say, well, he's my friend. Oh, well, okay. Again, it's a complete, satisfactory explanation of your action that doesn't need to be reduced any further.
So could I use the word religion as it's translated from Arabic, deen, the way of life? Is that the idea, the way of life?
Yeah, I don't.
Fasting is my way of life.
Right. I think I know what you mean by that, and that's an important point, because religion, even though it's a good, and there are other goods, it does have a particularly strategic place in the life of religious believers, because often it serves as a reason for doing many other things and for the way that one organizes one's whole life. I mean, that you pray at certain times, that you give alms, that you worship in a certain way, and even the way that you relate to other people, even though it's connected to other sorts of goods like friendship or life or knowledge or those things,
family,
is sorted through and organized often through religion also.
Now you have used this phrase, and we had talked about it earlier, this phrase that also, you're a very good writer, by the way, the religion as a good base on pluralism in contemporary society. Does the word pluralism mean source of authority? That's what I was asking you earlier. Religion as a basic, or let's put this correctly, religion as a good based on pluralism. Please.
Well, the reason, I mean, I talked about pluralism in that article in part because if you make the argument that religion is a basic form of good, and that this is a moral principle, in other words, which means that religion is a reason that deserves to be respected by everyone. And one of the reasons why, for example, we should see it protected in our Constitution and in our other laws, because it's a thing that we think of as a good that needs to be protected. If you say that, one kind of objection that people sometimes bring up is, well, no, but wait a minute, how can you privilege religion in a society that's pluralistic, where people believe a lot of different things about morality and religion? And maybe that's an objection to recognizing the
non-believers.
Non-believers, that's right. Maybe that's an objection to giving religion this kind of status within the Constitution and within the legal system. And so what I wanted to say is, well, pluralism means different things. And in one sense, pluralism can mean social pluralism, which is to say that within the larger societies, say within the United States, there are a plurality of other social groups at different levels of society, even political levels like states or counties, but social groups like families, religious groups, private associations of different kinds. And there's a plurality of these different groupings within societies, and some of them are religious groupings. And so one meaning of pluralism simply indicates that human beings, and this again is a good, because sociality is a good and friendship is a good, they see association with others as itself a reason for action. And those associations can be dedicated to other sorts of goods. And there's a lot of those within society. I mean, there's always a plurality of those. And a second way that pluralism can be used is when I say that there are various forms of good in addition to religion, so things like knowledge and life and friendship. So that's a plurality of goods. Now, there are some philosophers who have held that there are a plurality of goods in human life, and they don't go together. And so people have to make choices, and they have to choose for some goods and against some others. And I would not say that. I mean, it seems to me that the basic forms of good in society don't contradict one another. They're goods that all go into making a flourishing human life. Now, we choose to engage in some rather than others, but it's not that they're incoherent with one another. But they are plural. There is more than one. And so that's, religion is a good along with others, but one that doesn't contradict the others. And then there's a third meaning of pluralism, which is what the objection would go to, which is that there's just disagreement within our society about issues of morality and religion. And there, it seems to me, that's a fact. There is. And it doesn't decide anything, though. It's sort of like the weather. We know that there's disagreement about these things, and so we have to find ways to live together, even though there is this disagreement. And one of the ways that we do this is through practices of toleration, especially with respect to religious freedom.
Absolutely. You remind me of the Islamic tradition. In the Islamic tradition, there's a philosophy called El-Tawheed, the unity of God, the unity of creation, and the unity of all truths. And what we're doing here is, in our society, is to prioritize them, right? We're trying to figure out which is more important. And you're referring to Thomas Aquinas, which you've done often throughout your paper. His argument indicating that religion is a moral virtue, which you've mentioned, that one is obligated to cultivate as a matter of natural moral law. Beautifully stated, but expand the idea. Moral law, natural moral law. Does that really exist? Is that if it does, then it becomes a rational element, right?
Well, I think it does. You know, by natural law, Aquinas simply means morality. It means what we can know about morality on the basis of natural reason.
The right thing to do.
Exactly, the right thing to do. What are our obligations? What are our rights? How should we behave? How shouldn't we behave? Are all functions of morality. Now, the natural law indicates what we can know about morality as a result of our human nature, which is a rational nature. And now there's also, Aquinas says, divine law, which is what we can know about morality as a result of divine revelation. That doesn't contradict natural law, but it is different from natural law.
Well, it shouldn't contradict.
That's right. And now there's also human law, the laws that we make to govern society. And again, that shouldn't contradict natural law either, but it's different, right? The natural law morality, that is to say, doesn't tell us whether we should drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. I mean, we do it on the right. In England, they do it on the left. It's a decision that's made, and it's important that everybody does it the same way. But which it is morally indifferent. So the natural law has to do with what's morally right. And so in Aquinas' view, and obviously I agree with him in this, we have obligations to God. And those are a moral obligation to recognize God and to worship God, just as we have moral obligations to other people, to tell them the truth and to respect their lives and so forth.
Yes, sir. You have ended the Scholars Chair on a perfect note. Thank you so much for coming. I must say that I've learned a great deal in our discussion. Do you recommend a book?
Well, there's a recent book on religious freedom, if you're interested in that particular topic, called Why Religious Freedom Now, I think is the title, by a man named Timothy Shaw. And it's an excellent sort of summary of some of the problems of religious freedom internationally and nationally in the world today and the reasons why we should support it.
Beautiful. We've been talking to Professor Lewis, who is from Catholic University. We've been talking about religious freedom. If you want to know and see more scholarship programs, go online to readoncommunications.com. I'm Khalil Shadid. Good night.
Hit it.
Amazing.